Every night, millions of people wake up at exactly the same time. 2 a.m., 3 a.m., sometimes 4. They open their eyes, look at the ceiling, check the clock, and almost immediately, they start worrying. Why am I awake? Why can't I sleep? Am I developing insomnia? But what if the real mystery isn't why you woke up? What if the mystery is why you expected to stay asleep in the first place? Because for almost all of human history, waking up in the middle of the night wasn't considered a problem. It wasn't a sleep disorder. It wasn't something doctors tried to cure. It was simply how humans slept. The idea that a healthy person should sleep for one uninterrupted 8-hour block feels so obvious today that most of us never question it. But that idea is surprisingly new. It wasn't discovered in a laboratory, it wasn't handed down by evolution, and it certainly wasn't how your ancestors spent their nights. To understand why, we have to travel back through history, past the electric light, past the factory whistle, past the first cities, to a time when darkness ruled every human life, because somewhere along the way, civilization changed the night, and in doing so, it may have changed the way we think about sleep itself. Imagine standing beside a fire 50,000 years ago. There are no houses, no streetlights, no glowing phone screens. Beyond the fire, there is only darkness. The kind of darkness most of us have never experienced. The sun disappears. Within minutes, the world becomes almost completely black. You can't keep working. You can't scroll. The day is over. So your small band settles around the fire. Some talk quietly, others stare into the flames. Eventually, one by one, they fall asleep. For a long time, scientists assumed this was where the story became familiar. Humans slept. Morning came. The cycle repeated. But when researchers began studying some of the few remaining hunter-gatherer societies whose lifestyles still resemble our ancestors, they found something unexpected. Sleep wasn't nearly as rigid as modern life had taught us to believe. Sleep researcher Jerome Siegel and his colleagues spent years studying the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of Namibia, and the Tsimane of Bolivia. These communities don't live exactly like prehistoric humans, but they offer one of the closest windows we have into how people sleep without electricity, office hours, or alarm clocks. The results surprised many researchers. People didn't force themselves into perfect schedules. They usually fell asleep several hours after sunset. They woke naturally around sunrise. Most slept somewhere between 6 and 7.5 hours. And perhaps most importantly, waking during the night wasn't unusual. People sometimes opened their eyes, shifted position, spoke quietly, listened to the sounds around them, then drifted back to sleep. No panic, no clock watching, no fear that something had gone wrong. To them, it was simply part of the night. At first, that might not sound very remarkable until you realize something. Those communities lived close to the equator, where nights stay relatively short throughout the year. But what about everyone else? What happened when winter nights stretched for 12, 13, or even 14 hours? The human body doesn't need 14 hours of sleep. So what filled the rest of the darkness? For centuries, almost nobody asked that question. Then, by accident, a historian stumbled across a forgotten phrase buried inside a dusty court record. A phrase that would completely change our understanding of how humans once slept. It simply read, "After the first sleep." The historian had one question. If there was a first sleep, what happened after it? For years, nobody knew. The phrase appeared only briefly, almost casually, as though everyone reading it in the 17th century already understood exactly what it meant. Only we didn't. The historian who found it was Roger Eckhurch. At first he assumed it was nothing more than an unusual expression, a regional saying, maybe even a mistake. But curiosity has a habit of growing, so he looked for another reference, then another, and another. What began as a single forgotten phrase slowly became an obsession. For the next 16 years, Eckhurch searched through court records, medical books, private diaries, letters, plays, poems, and legal documents from across Europe. The deeper he looked, the stranger the picture became. First sleep wasn't unusual. It was everywhere. Not dozens of times, hundreds, eventually thousands. More than 2,000 separate references appeared across multiple countries and languages, and they all described the same thing. For centuries, people didn't expect to sleep through the entire night. They expected the night to happen in 2 parts. Soon after darkness fell, they went to bed. They slept for about 4 hours. This was their first sleep. Then, without an alarm, without noise, without panic, they woke. Naturally, not for 5 minutes. Sometimes for an hour, sometimes 2. And this wasn't the restless frustration we associate with insomnia today. Historical accounts describe something surprisingly peaceful. People simply accepted that they were awake. Some remained in bed, some lit a candle. Others stepped quietly through the house, careful not to wake anyone still sleeping. What happened during this strange hour says something remarkable about the human mind. Some prayed. Some talked softly with their husbands or wives. Some read by candlelight. Others repaired clothing, prepared food for the morning, or simply sat in silence. Medieval physicians even recommended this quiet interval for reflection and taking medicine, believing the body was especially receptive during these hours. And perhaps the most fascinating descriptions came from people who did absolutely nothing. They simply lay awake, not anxious, not restless, just thinking. Many describe this period as unusually calm, a state somewhere between dreaming and waking, a time when memories surfaced more easily, ideas connected in unexpected ways, problems felt strangely easier to solve. Today, we might call it creativity. To them, it was simply the middle of the night. The pattern became so ordinary that nobody bothered explaining it. Writers mentioned first sleep and second sleep, the way we'd casually mention breakfast or sunset. Everyone already knew, no explanation needed. And it wasn't only Europe. Similar descriptions appear in parts of Africa, South Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America. Different cultures, different languages, the same rhythm. Sleep, wake, sleep again. For thousands of years, this wasn't considered unusual. It was normal, which raises an obvious question. If nearly every society accepted waking in the middle of the night, why do we panic the moment it happens today? How did something so ordinary become a medical problem? The answer wasn't discovered by doctors. It wasn't discovered by scientists. It arrived with something much louder, a factory whistle. For most of human history, people worked when the sun was up. Farmers, blacksmiths, weavers, their days followed the sky. If winter brought longer nights, people simply spent more time in darkness. Life bent around nature. Then, nature was replaced by a clock. The Industrial Revolution changed something no civilization had ever changed before. For the first time in history, millions of people weren't expected to wake up when their bodies were ready. They were expected to wake up when the factory demanded it. The whistle didn't care whether you'd had a first sleep or a second. It didn't care whether you'd been awake peacefully for an hour. It only cared that you arrived on time. Late workers lost wages. Sometimes they lost their jobs. A sleep pattern that had worked for centuries suddenly became a liability. The body hadn't changed, the schedule had. At first, people struggled. Factory owners complained constantly about exhausted workers. Medical reports described fatigue, irregular sleep, and workers who couldn't adapt to the new routine. But nobody questioned the schedule. Instead, they questioned the worker. If you couldn't sleep through the night, the problem was assumed to be you, not the clock, not the factory, you. And then, just as people were learning to obey the clock, another invention quietly transformed the night forever. Electric light. Today, it's almost impossible to imagine darkness. Streetlights glow outside our windows. Televisions flicker late into the evening. Phones shine inches from our faces. But for almost all of human history, night actually meant night. Darkness wasn't simply the absence of light. It was a biological signal. As daylight faded, the brain began releasing melatonin. Body temperature slowly dropped. Heart rate slowed. Without thinking about it, your body prepared itself for sleep. Then, in 1879, Thomas Edison introduced the practical incandescent light bulb. He believed he was freeing humanity from darkness. In many ways, he did. People could work later, read later, build cities that never truly slept. But Edison also believed something else. He thought sleep itself was an inefficient habit. He reportedly slept only a few hours each night and dismissed long sleep as little more than a relic of humanity's primitive past. To him, darkness was the problem. Artificial light was the solution. What nobody fully understood at the time was that the human brain had spent hundreds of thousands of years using darkness as its clock. Electric light didn't simply brighten the night, it delayed the body's entire sleep process. People stayed awake longer. Bedtimes moved later, but factory whistles still sounded early the next morning, and suddenly there was no room left for the old rhythm, no room for a first sleep, no room for the quiet hour in between, no room for a second sleep. The long human night collapsed into a single race against the alarm clock. Within just a few generations, something remarkable happened. People forgot not just the pattern, the memory of the pattern. The phrases first sleep and second sleep slowly disappeared from everyday language. Children grew up believing sleep had always happened in one uninterrupted block. History itself seemed to forget, until something else appeared. Around the same time, segmented sleep vanished from ordinary life. A new word began appearing in medical books with increasing frequency: insomnia. Coincidence or consequence? That question would send modern sleep researchers back into the laboratory to discover what happens when human beings are finally allowed to experience darkness again. So, what happens when we remove the modern world? Not forever, just for a little while. Researchers have tried exactly that. In camping studies, participants left behind electric lights, phone screens, and late-night artificial illumination. For days, their only source of light was the sun and the fire. Something remarkable happened. Nobody told their bodies when to sleep. Nobody imposed a schedule. Yet their sleep began changing on its own. People became sleepy earlier. They woke closer to sunrise. Their internal clocks slowly drifted back toward the rhythm of natural daylight, and in some studies, another familiar pattern quietly returned. People naturally woke for a period during the night. Not everyone, not every night, but often enough to remind researchers of something important. Human sleep isn't as rigid as we once believed. It's flexible, far more flexible. Modern sleep science paints a more nuanced picture than people often imagine. Some people sleep soundly through the night. Others naturally wake once before drifting back to sleep. Both can be completely normal. What matters isn't whether you wake, it's what happens next. Because here's the part most people never hear. Sleep psychologists have found that one of the strongest predictors of chronic insomnia isn't waking up. It's becoming anxious because you woke up. You open your eyes. You check the clock. 3 o'clock. Immediately, your brain starts calculating. If I fall asleep now, I'll only get 4 hours. What if I'm exhausted tomorrow? What if this keeps happening? Your heart rate rises. Stress hormones begin increasing. Now your brain has a new problem to solve, not sleep. Threat. Ironically, the fear of insomnia can become one of insomnia's greatest causes. Sleep psychologist Greg Jacobs puts it simply. Waking during the night is part of normal human physiology. The panic is often what keeps people awake. That doesn't mean every case of insomnia is simply misunderstood. Far from it. Chronic insomnia is a real medical condition with many possible causes, and anyone struggling with persistent sleep problems should seek professional care. But for millions of healthy people, a brief awakening in the middle of the night isn't necessarily a sign that something is broken. It may simply be one expression of a sleep system that evolved long before alarm clocks, office hours, or glowing screens, and perhaps that's the strangest part of this story. We spend enormous amounts of time trying to control sleep, tracking it, optimizing it, scoring it, measuring every minute. Yet for almost all of human history, people trusted something we rarely trust anymore: their own bodies. Maybe that's the lesson hidden inside the forgotten hour. Not that everyone should divide their nights into 2 perfect sleeps. Modern life rarely makes that practical, and the evidence doesn't suggest there's one ancient pattern that every human being must follow. The lesson is much simpler. If you wake, don't assume you failed. Don't assume your brain is broken. Sometimes, the most natural thing you can do is nothing at all. Lie quietly. Breathe. Let your thoughts come and go. Allow sleep to return when it's ready. Because long before electricity, long before anyone counted 8 perfect hours, your ancestors spent countless nights doing exactly that. Perhaps the real mystery was never, why do we wake up at 3 a.m.? Perhaps the mystery is why we became so afraid of it. The next time you find yourself staring into the darkness, don't imagine you're alone. For thousands of generations, someone else was awake too. Not fighting the night, simply living through its quiet middle. And maybe, just maybe, your body isn't forgetting how to sleep. It's remembering a rhythm the modern world almost convinced us to forget.